Perhaps one of the most interesting features of Jorge Luis Borges' short story, Tlön, Uqbar, Orbus Tertius, is the description that is given not just of the culture but the thought of the people of Tlön, which is so different than that of our own world, where we have a lot of philosophies, they have a lot of philosophies, but they take idealism seriously in a way that we generally don't. And there's a nice little sum-up line here. Hume declared for all time that while Berkeley's arguments admit not the slightest refutation, they inspire not the slightest conviction. Hume says true for us. Borges actually, or the narrator, agrees. True for our Earth, at least into a certain point. Not true for Tlön at all. This fictional world that in its earliest iteration, just as a country, turns out Berkeley, at least in this narrative, had some role in. So if you're not familiar with Hume and Berkeley, two really important empiricist philosophers in modern philosophy, often called British empiricists, and Berkeley proposed idealism as opposed to materialism. He said that material objects don't really exist as material. They are ideas, bundles of ideas that we perceive, or that a single great mind, God, perceives, keeping them therefore in existence and available to us. So, there's a lot more that could be said about Berkeley, but let's jump right into Tlön. So Tlön is organized and governed by philosophical idealism, and Borges is doing kind of a thought experiment. What would a world like that turn out to be like by comparison to our own world? And he is going to tell us that the nations of this planet are idealistic. Their language and things derived from that language. Religion, literature, metaphysics presuppose idealism. Psychology is going to be massively important. He says it's no exaggeration to say that the classical culture of Tlön is composed of a single discipline, psychology, to which all others are subordinate. I have said that the people of that planet conceive of the universe as a series of mental processes that occur not in space, but rather successively in time. And then he's got an interesting comparison here. He says Spinoza, one of the great rationalist philosophers, endows his inexhaustible deity with the attributes of spatial extension and thought. No one in Tlön would understand the juxtaposition of the first, which is typical only of certain states, and the second, which is a perfect synonym for the cosmos. To put it another way, space is not conceived as having duration in time. So here's an example. The perception of a cloud of smoke on the horizon, then the countryside on fire, and the half-extinguished cigarette that produced the scorched earth is considered an example of the association of ideas. So the association of ideas is something that we see developing in modern philosophy, perhaps brought to its sort of classical point of view in David Hume, who talks explicitly about that, goes into phenomenology later on with people like Husserl and other philosophies as well. So we're going to get that idealism is the, so to speak, not even law of the land, but the background assumptions. And he goes on and he says, this thoroughgoing monism or idealism renders science null. You can't actually do science in any real way, so we don't actually have sciences as such, or if we do, they're weird, right? Geometry has two different parts to it, one of which corresponds to our geometry, others don't. And so, we're going to get a number of interesting developments coming out of this. And we'll come back to the monism bit in just a few moments. Let's talk about materialism. So what is materialism? Typically, it's being posed as sort of the opposite of idealism. There is matter out there independent of any observer, and perhaps the observer is made out of matter as well. So matter is the basis for things. And we can know some of it, but we can't know all of it. So, it assumes an external world that we can, you could say, access partially and build up idealistic mental pictures in our head. So these are viewed as opposites to each other. Now, here's where it gets very, very interesting. So if you have a culture, a civilization that has certain basic philosophical, specifically metaphysical assumptions, is it possible from within that framework to think something that doesn't fit into that framework? Well, we know that it is in our world because we've got, a vast proliferation of different metaphysical schemes, and sometimes they will have their own seeds of their destruction within them, right? Or we can have like a culture and people all think this way, but no, they don't. A prime example of this in the field of ethics would be Aristotle in a time when supposedly everyone believes in slavery, saying, yeah, some people don't. I am going to argue for a limited form of natural slavery. This is Politics, Book 1. A lot of people are arguing for slavery is great. I actually disagree with them. And there are some people who say that all slavery is based on force and therefore invalid. And so if a schema occupies all, you could say, intellectual space, it shouldn't be possible to find opposites. So within idealism, there are some people who raise the possibility of its opposite, right? And how is that going to work? So he tells us, of all the doctrines of Tlön, none has caused more uproar than materialism. Some thinkers have formulated this philosophy generally with less clarity than zeal, as though putting forth a paradox, something that is counterintuitive, that might be true, but it's going to be weird how it is true. In order to make this inconceivable thesis more easily understood, an 11th century heresiarch, right? So a heresiarch is somebody who's the ruler of a heretical school, is going to conceive of the sophism. Sophism is a bad argument, right? But one that you can't tell is bad right off the bat, of the 9 copper coins. A paradox as scandalously famous on Tlön as the Eleatic aporia are to ourselves. Now, what are the Eleatic aporia? Zeno's paradoxes. Maybe some stuff in Parmenides as well, right? And we look at those and we're like, well, those can't be right, but how are they actually wrong? I got to think about this a bit. So the 9 copper coins is a problem like that. And he says, there are many versions of that specious argument with varying numbers of coins and discoveries. Here's the most common. On Tuesday, X is walking along a deserted road and loses 9 copper coins. So there's our setup, right? On Thursday, Y finds 4 coins in the road, their luster somewhat dimmed by Wednesday's rain. On Friday, Z discovers 3 coins in the road. Friday morning, X finds 2 coins on the veranda of his house. So to us, no problem. We just told a story about some people losing coins, other people, including the original loser, finding coins, the number of coins added up. Great, we're perfectly fine. On Tlön, this is a problem. It says, from this story, the heresiarch wished to deduce the reality, the continuity in time of these coins, or namely objects. He says it's absurd to imagine 4 of the coins did not exist from Tuesday to Thursday, 3 from Tuesday to Friday afternoon, 2 from Tuesday to Friday morning. It is logical to think they did in fact exist, albeit in some secret way that we're forbidden to understand, at every moment of those 3 periods of time. So something that we take completely for granted, continuity of objects existing in time. The Tlönians find that idea abhorrent, or if not abhorrent, at least ridiculous. That's not the way things work in reality. And we get a really interesting description of a mental sort of process of sifting through this going on here. The language of Tlön resisted formulating this paradox. Most people did not understand it. So the language is already a problem. Once we get past that, the common sense school at first simply denied the anecdote's veracity. They claimed it was a verbal fallacy based on employment of two neologisms, words unauthorized by standard usage and foreign to all rigorous thought, the two verbs find and lose, which since they presuppose the identity of the first 9 coins, and the 9 latter ones entail a petitio principii. Now, petitio principii is a famous, sort of Latin way of expressing a begging the question, begging what was actually being brought at stake, literally asking for the principle. And it denotes a circular argument. So you make up some language, and from that language you deduce some things. That's the argument that's being made here against the supposed sophism. The critics reminded their listeners that all nouns have only metaphoric value. They denounced the misleading detail that the coin's luster was somewhat dimmed by Wednesday's rain as presupposing what it attempted to prove, the continuing existence of the 4 coins from Tuesday to Thursday. They explained that equality is one thing and identity another. They formulated a sort of reductio ad absurdum, so they're going to make an analogy here. The hypothetical case of 9 men who on 9 successive nights experience a sharp pain. Would it not be absurd, they asked, to pretend that the men had suffered one and the same pain? Not a very good refutation, because pain is, something within our bodies, unique to us, whereas copper coins that we can exchange back and forth do seem to be a little bit more publicly accessible. So that's what the common sense school does. This argument can't possibly be right. Then he adds, they claim the heresiarch was motivated by a blasphemous desire. What is that? To attribute the divine category being to a handful of mere coins, and that he sometimes denied plurality and sometimes did not. And then they argued if equality entailed identity, one would have to admit that the 9 coins were a single coin. And this is where we're starting to get to monism, right? And there's a lot of other resolutions that are being formulated. And then we get an orthodox thinker who finds what seems to be a good resolution, right? His happy conjecture was that there is but a single subject. That indivisible subject is every being in the universe, and the beings of the universes are the organs and masks of the deity, of God, right? X is Y and is also Z. Z discovers 3 coins then because he remembers that X lost them. X finds 2 coins on the veranda of his house because he remembers that the others have been found. And what does this lead to? An idealistic pantheism which triumphs over all other schools of thought. So, before that we've got this dizzying profusion of different points of view. Now idealistic pantheism becomes the one single successful point of view. Why? Well, it repudiates solipsism, the idea that we can't even say each, that there is only one conscious being in the universe and everything else is like figments of its imagination or whatever, solipsism, it by itself, right? Second, because it left intact the psychological foundation of the sciences. Now, that's a little weird to say because, as we heard earlier, the sciences don't really work in Tlön, right? And then third, because it preserved the possibility of religion. So, that's quite interesting. And then, the author mentioned Schopenhauer formulating a similar doctrine in the first volume of Par erga und par la pomena. So we go on and we now shift to this monism, right? Monism is the idea that ultimately only one thing is real or fundamental. It could be Spinoza's God or substance, right? It could be Hegel's world spirit, Geist, right? It could be whatever it is that you want. but you're saying that ultimately everything is one. So what we are is sort of just reflections of that. And, we've already got this coming up with this orthodox resolution. In literature, it leads to a very interesting approach. It was decided all books are the work of a single author who is timeless and anonymous. So no matter who is on the cover of the book, that's not the real author. It's this capital A author who presumably would also be God or whatever it is that is the underlying subject. And so what do? They take two dissimilar works, attribute them to a single author, determine the psychology of that. Every fiction has a single plot with every imaginable permutation. So you have monism, but you also have plurality within that monism. Books of a philosophical nature contain the thesis and the antithesis. A book that does not contain its counter book is considered incomplete. So that's when it comes to the thinking about it. Now there are some, what could we call them? Implications, outpourings, ways in which the world itself winds up being affected by this commitment to idealism and monism. And Borges here will talk about, he coins a term for this, of course, the people of Tlön, it's their native language, hrönir, right? And these are objects that are brought into being for the people that lose them, find them, think them, hope for them. And so he says, in the most ancient regions of Tlön, one may not infrequently observe the duplication of lost objects. Two persons are looking for a pencil. The first person finds it, but says nothing. The second finds a second pencil, no less real, but more in keeping with his expectations. These secondary objects are called hrönir, and they are, though awkwardly so, slightly longer. And he says, for a long time it was just going on like this. People would find stuff. It's kind of random. And then people realized they could systematically produce them. And that's been going on for about 100 years or so. He says, the first attempts were unsuccessful, but we can recall the modus operandi. There's a warden of a state prison who informs prisoners there's certain tombs in an ancient bed of a nearby river. He promises anyone who brings in an important find would be set free. So the inmates are shown photographs of what they're going to discover, and most of them don't find anything actually worthwhile. But then they repeat this at 4 high schools. And one of them, the students unearth or produce a gold mask, an archaic sword, 2 or 3 clay amphorae, and the verdigristan mutilated torso of a king with an inscription on the chest which is yet to be discovered. So this leads to systematic production of hrönir. And that also leads to a problem. It makes the past, as he says, as plastic and malleable as the future. Why? Archaeology can just sort of dream things into being or desire things into being. And then we get this interesting discussion of a curious bit of information. Hrönir of the second and third removed, hrönir derived from another hrön, and hrönir derived from the hrön of a hrön, exaggerate the aberrations of the first. Those of the fifth remove are almost identical. Those of the ninth can be confused with those of the second. Those of the 11th exhibit a purity of line that even the originals do not exhibit. The process is periodic. The hrönir of the 12th remove begin to degenerate. And then he talks about a special kind of hrön, the the thing produced by suggestion, the object brought forth by hope. The magnificent gold mask I mentioned is a distinguished example. He goes on and he concludes this part of the story by saying, things duplicate themselves on Tlön. They also tend to grow vague or sketchy and lose detail when they begin to be forgotten. And this leads us back to the idealism. When no mind is actually considering the object just kind of starts to fade a way which would make sense within an idealistic context. So this is all from the account that is being provided that the narrator will tell us about a bit later, as this weird world, fictional world, Tlön, will start to bleed over into our own. But it's good to know what Tlön itself looks like in terms of how idealism and monism play out in what they consider to be reality.